Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Maureen from the Embryology Lab. I'm one of the embryologists. I wanted to go live today with our new series. It's called Under the Microscope. And I thought every few weeks I could come on here and take some patient questions and talk about a few things from the lab, because I know a lot of what we do is kind of mysterious to you guys. So I hope you're having a good start to your holiday season. We're all wearing our Christmas hats here today. So I have my reindeer hat, we got Christmas trees, stockings, Santa Claus, all that stuff. So I'm just gonna give it a few minutes for people to come in. Today I wanted to talk about shipping eggs and embryos between our centers. So we can store your embryos at Syracuse, Colorado, Buffalo, Albany. So a lot of times patients are monitoring or create embryos in one location, and then they want to do their frozen embryo transfer in another location, and we are able to do that. We ship our embryos back and forth. If anyone on here could just type a comment so I know that the comments are working. This is my first time doing this by myself. That would be helpful. Okay, so when you're starting an FET sorry. Oh, hi, okay. Oh, wow, lots of highs. I think I just needed to hit that button. Thank you, thank you. Okay, so when you are starting your FET cycle, we need to make sure that your embryos are in the location where you're going to do your FET prior to you starting any of your medications. Because we don't know exactly how long you're going to be taking medications before your transfer. We ship embryos once a week, usually, sometimes every other week, depending on how many we have. So we don't want to run into any issues where a patient is ready to be in Syracuse this week and their embryos are in Albany and we're last minute trying to arrange tanks to ship back and forth. So here in Syracuse, we ship out every Tuesday. But we like to have all the paperwork and consent forms and shipping labels and everything ready to go prior to Tuesday so that everything runs smoothly. All of our embryos and eggs and sperm are shipped in big shipping containers that we fill with liquid nitrogen, and we actually dump the liquid nitrogen out right before we ship, but they're charged tanks, so they're very, very cold, and the tanks are sealed tightly, and they are also temperature monitored. So we have a device inside of them that will show us if, for any reason, the tank was not cold enough. So when we receive the embryos, we check our temperature monitoring device, and we make sure that all of the transport happens safely. Let's see. To ship between Albany, Buffalo, and Syracuse, it's $75. And to ship to Colorado, it's $405. And when you ship to Colorado, we have to have you pay that fee upfront. For Albany, Buffalo, and Syracuse, we will just bill you once the shipment is complete. So the best way to get a shipment initiated is to message your embryology team. So on your patient portal, under web messages, there's Embryology Syracuse, Embryology Buffalo, Albany, etc. So just send us a message and we will add you to our list. Let's see. Our embryos are shipped FedEx. We have tracking numbers. They're all shipped overnight. The tanks that we ship them in are good for over a week. 7 to 10 days is what we like to say. So if there were any shipping delays, your embryos would be safe, and you don't have to worry about that tank getting too warm. So someone's asking about the embryology lab in Buffalo. We have very experienced embryologists in Buffalo, and most of our embryologists come to Syracuse at least once so that we're all on the same page about our protocols. We follow the same protocols between labs. One thing to note is if you have eggs, embryos, or sperm in 2 different locations, you will be billed 2 separate storage fees. So if you're planning to move your embryos between locations, you might want to just move them all if you're changing centers rather than just move some and then move some at a later date, because you will get billed for 2 fees. Let me see. So a good time to follow up with us if you do want your embryos moved is when you get your cryolol report in your portal. So at the end of your cycle, once we freeze the embryos, we'll put a report into your portal telling you how many embryos were frozen and the grades of the embryos. And if you already know that you want to ship your embryos somewhere else, that's a good time to reach out to us. Does anyone have any questions? It doesn't have to be about shipping. No? Okay. Let's see. Another thing that we're getting a lot of questions about is thawing the embryos for PGT testing. And we have a pretty long wait list for that right now. So that's if you have embryos frozen and then you're deciding at a later date that you want them genetically tested. So that's going to be a little bit of a wait, especially with the holidays coming up. Our testing laboratory, Cooper Genomics, is closed through Christmas and part of New Year's. So we want to make sure that we're not trying to send them biopsy samples during that time. But let me see. So when we send our biopsy samples to Cooper Genomics, they arrive, so they are done by a courier service. The courier shows up at the lab and gets them to Cooper the same day. Whether they start it that day or the next morning, I'm not quite sure. But once they get the samples at Cooper, it takes 7 to 10 days to get the PGT results back. It's usually about 7, but sometimes 7 to 10. So when do you start? Let's see, I think I can get it so the comments show up on the screen. Oh, there we go. Okay. When do you start thawing process for FET and how often does it not survive thawing? So we do all of our embryo thaws in the morning. That's one of the first things we do. So we'll come right in, prepare our dishes. The culture dishes are prepared the night before. All of our embryos are sorted the day before, so we're ready to get rolling for those early morning frozen embryo transfers. It takes about 20 to 30 minutes for us to thaw the embryo, for it to go through the media and actually thaw out. Our survival rate is over 95%. Most of our embryos will survive the vitrification process. What we run into sometimes is when, not for transfers, but when people are thawing for biopsy, like I mentioned before, the embryo has to start growing again and it has to re-expand so that we can safely take some of the cells off in the biopsy and not harm the embryo. And sometimes if people start out with lesser quality embryos, there aren't enough cells to biopsy. So that can be a risk if you're thawing for genetic testing, but if you're just thawing for a transfer, I wouldn't worry too much about an embryo not surviving the thaw. If there was an issue of an embryo not surviving a thaw, we would call you in the morning and we would let you know what happened and offer to thaw an additional embryo for you that day. Can you tell a difference in embryos after a person has COVID? No, not that I've seen. We also don't really know which patients have had COVID or haven't had COVID once we have the embryos in the lab. So I don't know the answer to that one. "11 embryos make it to day 3. Let's see. Let me read this one. I had 11 embryos make it to day 3, then only 3 made to blast. 2 days 6 and 1 day 7. I think it's a sperm DNA issue, not an egg quality issue. If Dr. Kiltz is suggesting that it's a sperm issue, he is looking at your chart and has more information in front of him than I do right now. It does take both the egg and the sperm to make blastocysts, but there is a suggestion out there that if you have a lot of drop off on your embryos from day 3 to day 5, that it could be a male factor, but it does take both. So I can't tell you for sure without looking at your chart. There's some nice comments. Thank you, guys. Is there any evidence that embryos do better in a woman's body versus the lab? So that is a great question. I don't know the exact answer to that, but I do know that the advancements recently in culture media over the last probably 5-10 years, we can do a really good job at recreating the womb, I guess, in the lab. So some doctors are saying that now that our culture system is so good, that if embryos aren't making it to blast, then they would think they have a lower chance. But we see a lot of success with day 3 transfers, and the reasoning why we do day 3 transfers sometimes is just the number of embryos. So since we know that on average we lose about half of the embryos from day 3 to day 5, it's just kind of a natural selection process. Oftentimes we would rather just give the embryos a chance. If we hold them out in the lab and you lose some of your embryos and you start with such a small number, you may not be able to do a transfer. So it's not really a question we can answer because we can't simultaneously transfer a day 3 embryo and hold it in the lab, and every embryo is different. So there's not really a way to prove that one way or the other. What culture media do we use? We use Life Global culture media. Can you explain why the embryos are graded? We grade the embryos to help prioritize what we're going to transfer. So highly graded embryos have better success rates than lesser or poorer graded embryos, but that doesn't mean that a good graded embryo will be successful or that a poor graded embryo will not be successful. It's just a prioritization tool. So if you have a good, fair, and a poor embryo, we're going to transfer your good embryo first because it has a little higher chance of success. This is a great question. If you have to have embryos moved to another office, do you have to make sure they use the same culture media? So not necessarily the culture media, but you do want to use the same freezing and thawing media. So whatever freezing process, whatever kit, whatever media was used to freeze your embryos, you have to use the same kit to thaw the embryos. So that's why when we get embryos from other centers that they may use a different protocol than us, we have to special order a kit that matches how those embryos were frozen, which we do this, probably 1 or 2 times a week. So we do have a lot of experience with other kits, and we have protocols for all of them. And every time we order them, they come with instructions, and the lab that's sending us the embryos also sends us instructions. So we are prepared for those, but in general, especially if you're using eggs because they're more delicate, when you, it is like best practice to freeze and thaw your embryos at the same center. So, that could be all CNY Fertility, but if we're getting it from a different, network of labs, a different center, and they use a different protocol, they may have the best success rates with that protocol just because they do it on a daily basis. However, we are very confident in the ones that we do, and we do see a lot of success. So if you're shipping us embryos from another center, that is something that we will look at, and we will make sure that we are familiar and have protocols for the kit that they use, and then you may have to pay a fee for us to order the special thaw kit. So I hope that answered your question. So are each embryo stored in an identifiable manner, and which tests will be able to tell the sex of the embryos? Those are 2 very good questions. Yes, each embryo is labeled. So I brought a cryolock with me last time I was on, and maybe I'll bring it again. But the embryos are stored on these very thin plastic devices, and we have a special label printer where we print your name, your date of birth, your CNY Fertility ID number, the date that the embryo is frozen and the grade of the embryo all goes on that label and gets put on that thin plastic device, which the embryo is then put onto. So each individual embryo is labeled. Each patient will have their own cane, which holds all the cryolocks together, and that has your name on top, your unique ID, date of birth, all that. So we keep them separate by patient, and then each individual embryo is labeled. And then how can we tell the sex of the embryos? The only way that we can tell the sex of the embryos is through PGT testing. So the pre-implantation genetic testing, that's when we take a biopsy off of the embryo. So there's additional fees to do that, and we use Cooper Genomics. You can check out their website, and there's fees for Cooper Genomics as well. These are really good questions. It just takes me a second to read them. Thank you guys so much. Is it possible to add frozen embryos to a fresh embryo transfer if you are attempting to implant more than one? Yes, we do this sometimes. Say you have an egg retrieval and you only retrieve a few eggs, and you may end up with just one embryo to transfer, but you are transferring more than one due to your age or history. Again, we generally recommend only transferring one embryo at a time if you're under 35. But if for your circumstances we're transferring more than one, we can thaw one of your frozen embryos to go along with that cycle. However, we need to know in advance. So we prepare all of our media, our thaw preparation, your dishes, that's all prepared in advance. Our schedule is done in advance. So if I would let us know either when you're scheduling your retrieval with your nurse or the day of your retrieval at the very latest, to let the nurse and the embryologist know that you may want to thaw an embryo to go with your fresh cycle. And that doesn't mean we definitely have to thaw it. We can wait until we see how many embryos you get and if you need us to thaw it, but we would rather be prepared and have everything ready to go so that we can thaw the embryo. So that's a good question. We do that, yes. Okay, how often do you update a patient on their embryos after retrieval? That's a good question too. So you'll get a phone call on day 1, which is the day after your retrieval. A nurse will give you a call, check in on you, make sure you're feeling good, and she will tell you how many eggs we were able to inject and how many eggs fertilized. Then at that point, that's when you confirm your cycle plan. We should already know what we're doing with the embryos, but that's our last confirmation. So it's important to call your nurse back on day 1. So then we know whether we're planning an embryo transfer and what day it would happen, either day 3 or day 5. And then we know if you want us to freeze your embryos and if we're going to do that on day 3 or day 5. So once you make your plan with your nurse, if you're coming in for a transfer, we will talk to you the morning of your transfer, and we'll come in and show you photos of the embryos and discuss what to transfer. And if we're freezing the embryos and we freeze on day 3 or day 5, day 5, I say, is all-encompassing for day 5, 6, and 7. That just means the blastocyst stage, but we kind of throw it around as day 3 just to differentiate from, or day 5 just to differentiate from day 3. So day 5, 6, and 7 is when the blastocyst would be frozen, and then we put a report in your portal that lists how many embryos were frozen and the grades of those embryos. So embryologists are not typically calling the patients unless there's an issue or a question that we haven't gotten resolved on day 1. So I know it's hard to be patient, but at the end of the cycle, you will get the photos in your portal and the report. Okay, do you keep and allow transfer high-level mosaics and abnormal embryos? Yes, we do. We do allow transfer of abnormal and mosaic embryos. We just request that you speak to one of our providers, and we would recommend speaking to a genetic counselor at Cooper Genomics. So when you get your embryos PGT tested, the fee that you pay Cooper Genomics includes a free genetic consultation once you get your results. So if you have abnormal embryos, we prefer you to speak to a geneticist because they have all the literature and they can look up exactly which chromosome and which part of the chromosome was impacted and tell you what the implications of that may be. So we would prefer that you discuss with them just to cover all your bases before you do a high-level mosaic or abnormal embryo transfer, but you can certainly do that. We also have a consent for you to sign, just acknowledging that you're aware of the PGT results. So what's the difference between abnormal and mosaic embryos? So, oh, that's a long one. Okay, so mosaic embryos means that they found some normal cells and some abnormal cells. So if it's a low-level mosaic embryos, they found mostly normal cells, but some abnormal. If it's a high-level mosaic, they found mostly abnormal cells, but there were some normal. So it's complicated, but that honestly means that the inner cell mass, which develops into the baby, could be normal or it could be abnormal. They don't know. They found two different cell lines within the same embryo. Okay. So this question is saying, after my fresh transfer, I received a cryo report that never gave me an explanation of why 9 were discarded. What are the reasons why they would be discarded? So yes, you're going to get a report in your portal letting you know how many embryos were frozen and their grades. We don't call the patient at the end of the cycle to discuss how many were discarded. You can definitely reach out to us. You can schedule a follow-up talk with your provider. You can just message Embryology Syracuse and we'd be happy to explain to you the rest of the details of your cycle. It's just not something that we feasibly can do to call every single patient. So we don't expect to freeze all the embryos. There's going to be some drop off. So you might start with 20 eggs, but that doesn't necessarily mean you'll have 20 embryos. So not all the eggs may be mature and able to be injected. So you may have some immature eggs discarded. Not all the eggs may fertilize. So you may have about, 75% fertilized. And then of those, usually most fertilized eggs, most of them will make it to the day 3 stage. And then if we're holding out to blastocyst, like I said, we expect about half to make it to the blastocyst stage. So you may start with 20 eggs and end up with 5 embryos, and that's just very typical. So that's why we would not necessarily contact you, because it's normal. But we understand that you can certainly ask us questions and we'd be happy to explain it to you. How do you tell if embryos survive the thaw? So we look at the embryos under the microscope after the thaw, and we take their picture. And it's not so much that we can see they survived, it's that we can see if they don't survive. So if they don't survive, they're going to be very dark and grainy, and they're going to be like flat like a pancake when we go up and down on our microscope. They're not going to be like plump cells, so it's not going to be like a soccer ball, it's going to be like a pancake. So it's easy for us to tell if the embryo has degenerated or not. So this is a question about gender selection. So that would be doing PGT testing, and I think the question is, how often do you get what you want? And I really couldn't say. So it depends on your age, depends on the egg and sperm quality, it depends on how many eggs you start with, how many blastocysts you make, and how many are able to be biopsied and tested. So it's really a 50-50 chance whether they're going to end up being boys or girls, and then the rate of aneuploidy is going to be mostly based on your age and the egg and sperm quality. So it's vastly different for everyone. Okay, what percent survive thawing? So over 95% of our embryos will survive the thaw. Okay, have you seen Zyma reduce fragmentation in embryos? So Zyma is relatively new. We haven't been using it for very long. I haven't paid attention to a correlation between using Zyma and fragmentation in embryos. That would be based on the day 3 photos of the embryos. I know Zyma is used to help reduce DNA fragmentation in the sperm. All right. I'm just looking here through the questions. Okay. That's a lot of talking, you guys. So let me just look at my notes real quick and make sure I covered everything I wanted to about shipping. So to sum it up, send Embryology a message if you know that you want your embryos moved to a different location. The embryos need to be in the desired location prior to starting your stim meds for your FET. We ship every week, but we want to avoid any emergency shipments. So we really want to know ahead of time. All of our tanks are temperature monitored, so your embryos are safe. Anytime we do handle the embryos out of storage, there is an inherent risk because we're handling the embryos more than normal, but we take every precaution to make sure that they are safe. Okay, so I think that's all I'm going to do for today. I plan to do these every other week, so I will be back with you guys, and thank you for all the questions. If you have a suggestion for a topic, feel free to let us know, and I will see you next time. All right, thank you.